All right, sorry if this is a little bit choppy. I kind of got cut off in the process of making that video. So as we were kind of working on our first example of writing the converse, inverse, contrapositive, I highlighted our hypothesis in yellow, and that's our P, and our conclusion is our Q. Okay, so that's the conditional. That comes in the form P, then Q. To write the converse, we have to flip it. So it needs to come in the form Q, then P. So for me to flip the order, I am going to take you live in Minnesota and say if you live in Minnesota, then you live in Moorhead. So, like we said, the original statement said if you live in Moorhead, then you live in Minnesota. That is true, because Moorhead is in Minnesota, so the truth value is true. If you live in Minnesota, then you live in Moorhead. That is false. I could live in St. Cloud. I could live in the Twin Cities. So that one's not always going to be true. Okay? Our inverse. To write the inverse, we said we negate both. So the original statement came in the form P, then Q. For us to negate both, we'd say not P, then not Q. So I look at my original statement, I add the word not. If you do not live in Moorhead, then you do not live in Minnesota. Now that statement, if you don't live in Moorhead, then you don't live in Minnesota, that is also false. Because just because necessarily that I don't live in Moorhead doesn't necessarily mean I don't live in Minnesota. Okay, I could live somewhere along the lines of St. Cloud by not living in Moorhead, and St. Cloud is in Minnesota, so this statement is false. Like we said, the converse and the inverse are either both true or both false. In this case, they are both false. Now the contrapositive. To write the contrapositive, we flip and negate. So we take that original statement and do not Q, then not P. Flip and negate. Okay, so the original statement said if you live in Moorhead, then you live in Minnesota. So my Q needs to turn to a not, and I say if you do not live in Minnesota, then negate that original P, we would say then you do not live in Moorhead. Now that statement, if you don't live in Minnesota, then you don't live in Moorhead. That is true, because if I don't live in Minnesota, I cannot live in Moorhead. So the original statement and the contrapositive were both true. Original statement, contrapositive, both true, and the converse and the inverse were both false. Okay? So that is kind of where we're sitting there on our first example of writing these. We're going to do a couple more and hopefully pick up the pace here just a tiny bit. So, if two angles have the same measure, then they are congruent is the original statement. So our P is two angles have the same measure. The angles are congruent is the conclusion. So P here, Q there. Is that true? If two angles have the same measure, then the angles are congruent. That is true. They are equal in measure. So to write the converse, we flip it. Flip it. So take the Q, then the P. So if the angles are congruent, then the two angles in this case are congruent. So, is that one true? If the two angles are congruent, then the two angles, or sorry, if the two angles are congruent, then the two angles, I made an error. My P here needed to say two angles have the same measure. So I made a mistake. Have the same measure. I'm going to delete the angles are congruent factor. This video, I'm not going to lie, has been one of the toughest ones for me to make, mainly because there's so much writing. So please bear with me on this one. They will all not be this long and should all flow a little bit quicker. So, truth value here. If the two angles are congruent, then the two angles have the same measure. That is true. So, the original statement is true. That means that the contrapositive also has to be true. So I'm going to just fly down there and say that that was true, because the original and the contrapositive have the same truth value, and the inverse and the converse also have to have the same truth value, so these would also both be true. So all four should end up being true. All right, let's write the inverse now. Inverse, negate both. So not P, then not Q. Order doesn't change, just add the word not. So we'd say if two angles do not have the same measure, comma, then the angles are not congruent. How does that make sense? If two angles don't have the same measure, so like an 80 and a 70, then they are not congruent. That is true. Contrapositive. To write the contrapositive, we flip and negate. Both. So not Q, then not P. So the order is going to change and make them both say not. So if the two angles are not congruent, then the two angles do not have the same measure. And that one's also true. If the two angles are not congruent, they cannot have the same measure. All right? So, in this case, all four of our statements ended up being true. And really that leads us to a definition. And we can write a definition as a conditional statement or as its converse, because they are both true. Okay? So when I look at a slight example of this, we can use perpendicular lines. And we'd say if two perpendicular lines form a right angle, then they are perpendicular. If two perpendicular lines are occurring, then they intersect to form a right angle. So both the original statement and the converse, when you flip the order, they're both true. And if that's the case, we can write it as a definition. So original statement true, converse true, can be a definition. And definitions, lastly, wrapping things up, they can be written as a biconditional. And we write this biconditional statement when both the conditional statement, so the original, and the converse are true. We use the words if and only if. In wording, we would say P if and only if Q, and the symbols is P, arrow both directions, Q. So we're going to rewrite the definition of a right angle as a biconditional statement. So an angle is a right angle when its measure is 90 degrees. I know that that's the definition of a right angle, so I'm not going to rewrite it in if-then form and show that the converse is also true. We're going to take for the matter of fact that it is a definition. Okay? So for me to rewrite that as a biconditional, I would say an angle is a right angle IFF. Reason why I used IFF is that is the abbreviation for if and only if. Okay? So an angle is a right angle if and only if its measure is 90 degrees. And that wraps up our video. I'm sorry it got long, but we will also be going over some of this in our Google Meet. Kind of a tough process here because there's a lot of writing involved. Have a good rest of the day.